Welcome to Texts in the Cities. My name is J Murray and I'm your host for today. And we're going to be talking about A Christmas Carol with Dr. Grace Moore, who is an absolutely excellent guest to have on stage. She's the author of the Victorian novel In Context and Dickens and Empire, Discourses of Class, Race and Colonialism in the Works of Charles Dickens, which was shortlisted for the 2006 New South Wales Premier's Awards. She is also the editor of Pirates and Mutineers of the 19th Century, and the co-editor of Victorian Crime, Madness and Sensation, as well as a million other articles on Dickens and Victorianism and crime. She's a Dickens scholar too, which obviously she's a Dickens scholar, which is why we've got her up here. And I wanted to ask her, starting off, how do you get to be a Dickens scholar? What happens in your life that you turn to Charles Dickens?
Instead of turning to drink, I guess. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I never thought I would be a Dickens scholar. I knew when I was about 14 that I wanted to be an academic, and I realise that sounds a bit odd, that people don't usually want to be academics when they're 14, but I did. And I always thought that I would be a Thomas Hardy scholar because I grew up in Dorset. And then as I was sitting my A-levels, I met with someone who had been to my school, who had sort of made it to Cambridge and who was an incredibly impressive person. And he said, you know, Grace, you should read some more Dickens. And I'd read Dickens as a child and not really liked him. I think I was too young. My mother tried to get me to read A Tale of Two Cities when I was 7, and I think that might have been a bit too early. And so because I respected this person, I took his ideas to heart. And then when I got to university, the academic I most admired was a Dickens scholar too, and I just kind of caught it from him. He was such a passionate, enthusiastic teacher that I just thought, I want to do some more of this. And gradually I found that everything kept coming back to Dickens, and from that point I kind of labelled myself a Dickens scholar, and I haven't really looked back from then.
But your A-levels in England are when you're about 17, 18, aren't they?
That's right.
So this is when our audience could be catching the Dickens bug as well.
You could be catching the Dickens bug.
This is what you could be doing with A Christmas Carol this year. Just before we go into talking about the book too, can we have a show of hands for how many of you have read A Christmas Carol yet? Very good.
That's a good show.
So we don't need to do a synopsis. We'll jump right into asking you, Grace, to give us a little bit about the background of England at the time that A Christmas Carol was written and where it sits in Dickens' career as well.
Sure. This is, it's still quite an early novel for Dickens. A Christmas Carol is, it's a strange sort of piece of writing. Dickens, in the early 1840s, had been engaging with a parliamentary report about child labour in factories, and he promised Dr. Southwood Smith, who was the head of the Royal Commission investigating child labour, that he would produce an article for the Edinburgh Review, which was a very highbrow periodical and very unlike anything that Dickens would actually do. And Dickens, sort of having committed to do this, prevaricated a bit and said, you know, I might just reconfigure this a little bit, and he kept changing his mind about what he was going to do. And then finally he wrote Southwood Smith this letter and said, you know, I will do such a great thing. It'll be better than this article. It's going to be driving a sledgehammer home for social reform. And so instead of writing this dry expose of factory conditions, he wrote A Christmas Carol instead. And Dickens scholars are really interested in that decision. And Rosemary Bodenheimer, who is the author of a fairly recent book called Knowing Dickens, thinks that some of that might be connected to Dickens' own psychology, and that Dickens may have actually found it very traumatic to think about working children, having had a brush with being a working child himself. Do you all know the story of Dickens and the blacking factory? Some of you are nodding, some of you are shaking your heads. Can I briefly tell that story? As a child, Dickens grew up in a household that was middle class and aspirational, and his father, John Dickens, was an incredibly charismatic, flamboyant man who seemed completely incapable of living within his means. And so when Dickens was 12 or 13, John Dickens was imprisoned for debt. And in the 19th century, if you were imprisoned for debt, you went to a debtor's prison and you took your family with you. And the family could leave and go out and work and do whatever they needed to do. But the debtor had to remain within the prison. And so Dickens was actually, at a very, very young age, he was sent out to work. And having been raised with expectations that he would go to school and that he would follow some kind of profession, he found himself employed in a factory pasting labels on bottles of boot polish. So you can imagine what a come down this would be. And Dickens seems to have been an incredibly imaginative, rather extraordinary child. And to make matters even worse, his sister Fanny was at the same time pursuing study at the Royal College of Music. So there's a real sense of kind of inequality in the way these two children were being treated. And Dickens, although he only spent a few months in the blacking factory, he never recovered from that. It really traumatized him. It ruined his relationship with his mother because his mother resisted the idea that he should be pulled out of the factory as soon as the family came out of debt, and he never forgave her for that. But it also made him the person he turned out to be, and he acknowledged in a number of letters that to his friend John Forster, who was the only person in Dickens's lifetime who knew about this, he acknowledged that these were the forces that made him who he was. This was what gave him his ambition and drive. But Rosemary Bodenheimer says that because Dickens had this early brush with poverty, because he was so much in danger of sliding into the abyss of poverty, that he found it very difficult to write about working children. And if you read Dickens's novels, you don't see many children who work in factories. Most of the children you see in Dickens's novels who have jobs have domestic jobs. They work within the home. And she attributes this to Dickens's lasting trauma. Now, she's not plucking these ideas out of nowhere. One of the reasons she's following this line of investigation is that she's thinking about Dickens's decision to name one of his arch villains, Fagin from Oliver Twist, after a young boy called Bob Fagin, whom he met at Warren's blacking factory. And actually, Bob was a very good friend to Dickens and tried to take care of him. But Dickens seems to have kind of internalized some sort of resentment against him. So it's very complex. And Dickens is a very psychologically complex man, and I think that comes through in some of his characters.
It definitely comes through in parts of A Christmas Carol too. I mean, what's very interesting about this text too, what I found interesting is just how twee it is compared to the other things that I've read of Dickens's, and yet when I reread it, I still cried at the end, which is ridiculous. I don't know if I was just exhausted or if I'd had too much caffeine, but Tiny Tim still did it for me. And what parts do you think in A Christmas Carol come from inside Dickens there? What characters? You said Fagin. Are there any true to life characters within A Christmas Carol?
Absolutely, I think there are. Dickens is responding to a changing social climate, a social climate in which poverty is just absolutely terrifying for many people, and in which there's a great deal of social division. And the characters' want and ignorance are very definitely responding to the climate of the 1840s. The 40s, as you probably know, were known as the hungry 40s. That's partly because the price of bread was so high. It's also, of course, because of the Irish potato famine and the arrival of migrants from Ireland into mainland Britain. And want and ignorance really, I think, in a novel that is otherwise quite sentimental, are a way of reminding the reader of how the other half lives. That not all paupers in Victorian London are twee and good like Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim and his family would have been classified as the deserving poor. But there's this other area of London, this kind of this underbelly of London that is populated by people like want and ignorance. And I think Dickens is trying to frighten his readers. He's giving us the acceptable face of poverty through the figures of the Cratchit family, but he's also trying to alert his readers to just how dangerous it is to ignore poverty, and that if they don't do something to improve conditions for the many street children in London, for the many paupers on the streets of London, then these people are actually going to seize something for themselves. They will grow up to be wolfish, terrifying figures. So want and ignorance sit very, very uncomfortably in that story. They
really do. It's the only point at which you sort of have that cold shock out of his almost sort of humour and laughing at himself. There's no humour in that section at all. It's a really strange. It sits on that sort of cusp of the story where he starts getting bleaker as well.
Absolutely.
And I guess we will open for questions at the end, so keep any questions you have that are close textual, structural questions that you really wish you'd asked a Dickens scholar in mind now, and we'll be open for grace at the end. But on that structural issue, it opens with sort of happiness and reflection and and then it moves through these different stages. Could you talk a little bit to how he structured that and maybe why he did too?
Absolutely. I think Dickens is very clever about the structure of A Christmas Carol. It's arranged in staves, so we're invited to think of it as a kind of light musical piece. But as it unfolds, as Ruby's suggesting, it's something much darker than that. And Dickens is unique, I think, among 19th century novelists in that he's able to speak to an incredibly broad audience. You probably know that many of his novels were published in serials. A Christmas Carol actually wasn't, it was a standalone volume, but many of them were serialized, and that allowed Dickens to talk to a really big, diverse group of people. So working class people read his stories, middle class people read his stories, and the aristocracy read his stories, and so there's a huge audience, and Dickens has to be very careful not to alienate any of them. So what he does is he begins A Christmas Carol as though it's a kind of jolly story that's being told around a Christmas hearth. He really plays up the domestic very, very cleverly, and then he gradually moves into this kind of darker, bleaker social commentary. And then, having shocked his readers with this, he then moves out again and makes it a Christmas story. And so we come away from A Christmas Carol with food for thought, but we don't come away, I think, feeling that Dickens has been preaching to us. We don't feel as though he's just been kind of wagging his finger at us and giving us an intensive moral lesson. So I think it's very, very clever the way he puts all of the hard social commentary kind of in the middle of the novella, and then rounds it all up to make us feel jolly again as we witness Scrooge's redemption.
The role of the ghosts too, in having three ghosts rather than any other sort of missionary, any other sort of redemptive figure. Why did he choose ghosts, especially at a time when, religion was on the rise again, or not that it's ever not on the rise, but there was a very religious culture, and he seems to, even though he was a religious man, he seems to have chosen a secular story. Why ghosts and why the secular?
I think Dickens is fascinated by ghosts, and he's interested throughout his career in the supernatural, even though at times he's often very dismissive of it. And I think a ghost story is kind of appropriate for Christmas, so I think that's part of it. I think the other part is that if he had a human character revealing some of these things about Scrooge, it would have seemed too much as though Dickens were preaching. And so I think making these spirits ghostly gives the story a little bit of novelty. It also gives it a kind of lightness. This is something fantastic. And so we can kind of treat it as a Christmas story if we want to. We can also read it as a social commentary if we're prepared to accept that kind of more forceful reading.
One of the hard things about this text, I think, too, when you're reading it, is just not knowing what came before it. Because it seems like such an eternal text to us now. We've read it so many times, we've seen it reiterated so many times within culture. I just sort of become confused reading it, thinking, is this what Dickens made up, or is he just did this because it seems so eternal? There's some things that are there forever, and The Christmas Carol is just one of them. As far as the role of ghosts too, the second ghost has an interesting role in the story, in that he's only alive for one night. And then he dies at the end, and I guess that he acts as that bridge too between the jolliness and the misery. But time is an interesting sort of structure, and it's reiterated again and again as a theme. Do you have any sort of magic insights you can give us on time and what it's doing? You said that in the green room that you have students that are doing time travel studies. Are they looking at A Christmas Carol, or is
certainly people do treat A Christmas Carol as a time travel narrative, and of course the chronology of the story is rather skewed, because at the outset we're told that this will happen over a sequence of nights, and then it's compressed into one night, and then Scrooge seems to travel backwards through time, not only with the ghosts but also when the ghosts arrive at different stages. So there's something very odd going on. This might of course be because it's all a dream. Scrooge after all ends up kind of clutching his bedclothes, or it might be because of the incredible powers of the various spirits concerned. But I think it's again part of the kind of festive, jolly Christmas nature that Dickens is a little bit cavalier with time, and Christmas is a time when regular structures maybe don't apply. It's a bit like Fezziwig's Ball. This is not a time for regular behaviour, it's a time for revelry.
Does it then fail as a social critique in some way if it's only asking us to be generous at Christmas? Is it not radical enough, or not as radical as as it could be?
I don't think that's what Dickens is saying. When Scrooge says, I will live in the past, present and the future, I think, maybe I'm overreading it, but I think he's also kind of thinking about the Christmas message and allowing the Christmas spirit to infuse his behaviour through the future. And certainly Scrooge's redemption, as the narrator tells us when the story is wrapped up, isn't restricted to just being good at Christmas. It's all about being good all the year round. So I think what Dickens wants is for people to kind of to allow the Christmas spirit into their lives and to let it be part of their lives every day of the year.
Yeah. It's an interesting... when I was doing background research, I found two sort of very conflicting quotes, one from Karl Marx and one from Lenin, on what A Christmas Carol means. And of course, Karl Marx was a contemporary of Dickens. And the Communist Manifesto came out in 1948, just after he finished up with his Christmas series. And well, Lenin is said to have walked out of a performance in the 1920s of Dickens because he said that Dickens' middle-class sentimentality got on his nerves. Karl Marx said that Dickens issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists and moralists put together, which is a pretty high claim for A Christmas Carol. Which side of that divide do you sit on? Do you think he's a little bit sort of conservative, or is he super radical?
As always, I'm with Marx.
You're with Marx.
Yeah. No, I think he's, it's difficult to comment on Dickens based on productions of his work anyway. I mean, Dickens himself attended performances of his own work, some of which were authorised performances, many of which were not. And he talks about going to see Oliver Twist one day and actually lying down in the box at the end of the first act and never getting up again because it was just so awful. But I think, Dickens does something very special. He does something that nobody else in the 19th century was able to do on quite the same scale. He put social reform on the middle-class radar by sliding it into these stories. And he took himself very, very seriously. He took his role as a social reform novelist very, very seriously. He didn't just write about this stuff because, he thought it would sell books. He wrote about it because he really believed that he could bring about reform through his fiction, and he wanted to use that amazing influence he had for good. It's why he actually goes through a very personally bleak period in the 1850s when he starts to realise that he's writing all of these fantastic social reform novels and that things just aren't moving quickly enough. People are sort of sympathising with characters like Tiny Tim, but they're not doing enough to change their lives, to really act to improve social conditions.
He was a great idealist. He really did think, that's a beautiful quote you have of him saying that he's going to smash through the social divide with A Christmas Carol. Do you think that he would be... there's a terrible irony too in that he's part of the revivification of Christmas. Christmas cards came out. Who was I'm having a blank, the king at the time, who was part of the move to get Christmas bigger as well. And was very
you're
involved.
Probably thinking about Prince Albert.
Prince Albert, there we go. Do you think he's turning in his grave now that Christmas has become... and he's part of this too, and we retell it every time we go to buy gluts of stuff every Christmas. Would he approve?
Dickens was part of all of this, as you're suggesting. So, he's definitely got a role to play in the commercialisation of Christmas. He produced A Christmas Carol very deliberately in a very beautiful, elaborate format. It was on sale with lavish colour illustrations, and he hoped that the work would make him a fortune. It actually didn't, because the first edition, which sold out very quickly, absorbed nearly all of its profits in printers' costs and production costs. So it's a kind of tragedy surrounding that text. But then subsequently, A Christmas Carol was so popular that he went on to produce a number of Christmas books, and then later, when he had his own journals, Household Words, and then later All the Year Round, he would deliberately produce a special Christmas number because he knew the public liked it. Part of that's idealism, and part of it's just kind of commercial savvy. Dickens knew his market. He knew that people wanted to buy Christmas, and so he would give them a piece of it. But he never moves away from that connection between Christmas and social reform. So I think if he were turning in his grave, it would probably be because we're kind of more obsessed with the consumerist element than we are with reaching out to other people. I think that's really what Dickens wants to do. He doesn't mind us having a good time at Christmas. He doesn't mind us celebrating, but he also wants to think us to think about those who are less fortunate than ourselves.
On the level of reaching out to other people too, language plays, that language of reaching and grasping plays such an interesting sort of role within Dickens. And I guess what's beautiful about studying this as a text too is you can look at the language on so many different levels, and there's so many images going on. George Orwell, I've got another quote here because I always love the quotes when I go doing my research, said that the outstanding, unmistakable mark of Dickens' writing is the unnecessary detail. His imagination overwhelms everything like a kind of weed. Do you think are there parts that stand out to you when you think of A Christmas Carol where the language sort of strikes you as a scholar as incredibly meaningful, whether it be the food or images of light? Are there any tropes that you find?
There are lots. That's a wonderful question and a terrible question because I could ramble on for hours about it. Food is definitely very important in this novel, and it's interesting the way in which the text fixates on feasting, and so there are lots of images of feasting. I'm thinking particularly of Fezziwig's Ball, but it's also really interested in scarcity as well, and when people don't have food. So you might have noticed, for instance, that the Cratchits have a goose in the initial when we see them for the first vision, when they appear, and they're talking about the children going to the baker's shop and being able to smell the aroma of their own goose. Then later, when Scrooge buys them the prized turkey, it's a turkey. And what this tells us is actually, a goose was a poor man's food in the 19th century. If you were to have a goose, then it suggested that you really didn't have particular means, whereas a turkey was something favoured by the wealthy. And so that shows us a really important transition in the Cratchits' fortunes, that they've been given this turkey, they've been given this really good food. There are lots of other food scenes that I could talk about. The other thing that really resonates for me when I'm reading A Christmas Carol is the representation of music. And, of course, the format of the carol is suggesting that it is a piece of music, but also Scrooge's memories are stirred by music. So there's that gorgeous scene where he's moved by hearing his nephew singing a song that he's heard his sister sing when she was a child, his dead sister. And it's part of Scrooge's rehabilitation. So I think Dickens uses music as an aid to memory. And memory is so incredibly important in Scrooge finding himself and rehabilitating himself. Michael Slater, very famous Dickens scholar and author of a really, really good biography of Dickens. If you're going to read a biography, then it's Slater's biography that you should read. Slater talks about memory being the key to Charles Dickens, and I think he's absolutely spot on. And memory is also, I think, the key to A Christmas Carol, that once Scrooge is able to remember himself as a boy, then he's able to find himself again and to find kindness and compassion in his heart.
It's a really interesting idea too, because it's such a modern idea in so many ways. Our modern understandings of therapy, which came so much later than Dickens, and that whole idea of reimagining your past and resituating yourself within it. It's such he's an impressive writer on so many levels, but that element of modernity that Dickens always holds is either very sad for us that we haven't moved on far enough to have it still relevant 150 years later, or just an incredible testament to his work, I think. On that note too, and we will open up in about 5 minutes, so do keep those questions in your head. On that note of modernity too, one thing that does strike me when I read Dickens, and you mentioned earlier his relationship with his mother and how that has tinged his sort of personal sorrows, but is the absence of women, and I'm so notorious for this at this particular session, always being like, where'd the women go in this book? Because we do to some classics. Do women play any role of importance in A Christmas Carol, and is that typical of Dickens' work, or?
Yes, some of Dickens's women can be quite toe-curling, it's true. I think the women in A Christmas Carol, for the most part, do play important roles. Scrooge's sister, for instance, his memories of his sister are very important in softening him. Then there's Bob Cratchit's wife, who is the person who's able to articulate in terms that Scrooge will understand exactly what is wrong with Ebenezer Scrooge. And then there's terrifying women at the end of the novella, who have always been, for me, the creepiest part of the novel. I find them far more sinister than any of the ghosts. But the women who have stolen the clothes from Scrooge, who are just just kind of scavenging on his corpse, also play a really important role in just revealing how unpopular Scrooge is. So I think that womanhood is important. And I guess for me there's also something, this is kind of cheating in answering your question, but there's also something quite feminine about Bob Cratchit. He's an incredibly nurturing, soft, gentle kind of father, very different from the sort of stern Victorian paterfamilias we're accustomed to in 19th century novels. And so he's kind of, he's a very feminized character, I think.
Yeah, Bob Cratchit's interesting, and you mentioned that before when we were doing the prep for this, that he was seen as the central character often and not Scrooge, which obviously Scrooge has come down and stayed with us, but for Dickens and was it for the Victorians as well, it was Cratchit, not Scrooge?
Absolutely. It seems strange today. I was staggered when I read this. But while we think of Scrooge as being the central protagonist, when people put on theatrical productions of A Christmas Carol in the 19th century, they would always use their top actor to play Bob Cratchit and not Scrooge. And so there's a real sort of shift in the way we understand A Christmas Carol. If you think about Cratchit being so central to it rather than Ebenezer Scrooge, for me, it's always been a story about Scrooge. It's always been a story about redemption. And, the miser is the person who comes out of this story. The word Scrooge is almost synonymous, I think, for us with A Christmas Carol. So it's a very interesting cultural shift.
Yeah. Before we open up for you, and this is the last one of mine, although I'll have plenty more if you don't have any, I was going to ask you on behalf of the audience too, as a literary scholar, how you approach texts, and if you have any tips you can give about when you sit down and have this thing that everybody else is writing, what do you bring to it that can potentially get you a little bit up in an exam room?
Well, I'm not a VCE examiner, so I can only speak of what I'm looking for when I'm marking an essay. I'm interested in essays that are well contextualized. I want to read from writers who are able to write with authority about the social context of the work. So often that involves doing a little bit of historical contextual research. I'm also interested in ideas that are well substantiated. So for me, you can pretty much say anything you like about a text so long as you then support that with careful close reading and textual analysis. Close reading is one of those underrated skills, but it's really, I think, what examiners want to see you do. They want to see you pay detailed attention to the text. So if, for instance, you were writing about food in A Christmas Carol, you might spend time looking at the lavish depictions of shop windows in that novella and the way in which the story is just so interested in food. You might think about paying attention to feasting and banqueting and just finding lots and lots of textual evidence to support what you want to say. I also want to see an essay with a strong through argument. So you need to know what you're arguing at the outset and to be very clear about that and not sort of ramble through and finally come to it at the end. And you'll find that if you can do that, if you can articulate your argument in the first paragraph, a strong first paragraph will signpost the rest of the essay and it'll almost write it for you.
I had one English teacher once in high school who was like, essay writing, you just have to tell us what you're going to say us, then tell us what you've said. And I thought that actually works quite well. Were there any audience questions at this point, or can I please carry along? We've got some roving microphones here that will carry out to you if you have them. No? Try and think of them or you'll be kicking yourself in November this year, trust me. Oh, there's one right there.
Just talking about food, when they have the goose, and what I remembered was Scrooge thought it was like the biggest feast they could have or something like that, and I just wanted to know what you thought about that aspect of the feast. Like they thought it was a big feast even though it was just a goose. Do you know what I mean?
When the Cratchits, yes, that's the narrator deals with that really nicely, I think, and it's a way of alerting us to the fact that the Cratchits are the deserving poor. These are people who are really kind of they're not malcontents. These are people who are very, very poor, but doing the best with what they have. And so I think the narrative talks about how none of them will say what a very small goose it is. None of them will say what an undersized pudding it is. They're all just kind of celebrating the largesse and bounty of Christmas. But for us as readers to look at it, and for Scrooge to look at it, it's really something very, very meagre. And so it's telling us things about the scarcity in the Cratchits' daily lives, but it's also telling us things about how worthy they are, how deserving they are. These are good paupers.
That's interesting too. You just said the narrator, and that made me remember that I meant to ask you about the narrator in the story, because it comes up in first person, maybe twice or three times. Not very often you get this fallback to "I am telling you this, I am telling you that." Is it Dickens talking, or is the first person someone else?
That's a hard one to answer. I'm always very nervous of identifying an omniscient narrator with the author. I think it's something we need to be a little bit wary of. But, there's definitely a sense in which Dickens is imposing order on this story through that narrative technique. And I think he's doing this to replicate that sense of the oral experience of hearing a Christmas story. This is a story that can be told around a fire, and there's anecdotal evidence of working men's clubs getting together, spending the money to buy this story, and then for a designated reader to read it aloud to an audience who often weren't even literate. You've got to remember that literacy rates in the 1840s weren't particularly high, but we know through anecdotal evidence that lots of working people were exposed to Dickens because of these public readings of his work.
It's true. Grace mentioned before the role of reading biographies too, and I'm thinking as she's talking more and more about Dickens's life, it was Michael Slater's biography you mentioned.
That's right.
I found that too, just in even doing history subjects too, that I know you have a lot of reading on your plate at the moment, but it really is such a great way to get an insight into what's going on, especially when you're asked questions about the author's personal experience and what he's bringing into the narrative as well.
I think that's right. It's material that you probably won't use when you're responding to your exam questions, but it'll just help you to get more of an insight into the writer you're dealing with. And that will then in turn help you to write with much more confidence. So it's kind of, it's invisible labour. You won't necessarily parade this in front of your examiners because your questions are very, very unlikely to ask you a biographical question. But it'll just help you understand some of the themes that are driving Dickens, some of the concerns that are really important to him.
And if anyone's doing revolutions, it'll help you in that too. Any questions? There's one up the front here, and then maybe that wasn't a question. That was just a wave.
Scrooge is a very harsh character, so how do you think Dickens makes him someone that we can sympathise with?
I think if Scrooge were a miser throughout the narrative, then we would find it very, very difficult to sympathise with him. I think probably the key to our sympathy with Scrooge is when his sister comes to collect him from school, because it's clear at that point that there's something not quite right about his home life. And we don't get very much detail because it's a very short novella. But his little sister says, "Father is so much more kind than he used to be." Or maybe she says, "so much kinder than he used to be." And that tells us that there's something wrong at home, and that Scrooge has been abandoned to school. And often when boys were sent away to schools like Scrooge's school, they didn't always come home for the holidays. Sometimes these schools were used as dumping grounds, and the boys were just kind of left there, and nobody really cared if they lived or died. It's something that Dickens exposes in Nicholas Nickleby. And this, I think it's the beginning of a very, very kind of subtle thread that leads us to believe that Scrooge has been damaged in some way. He's a damaged figure. And this comes through when he's having that interview with his fiancée, where she's saying to him that she's been displaced by an idol, and the idol is money. And it's clear, she says to him, "You fear the world, Ebenezer." And there's something again that it's shaped him in some way, it's damaged him in some way. And as somebody who is scarred by experience, scarred by abandonment, I think that enables us to want Scrooge to be redeemed and to think that there's something in him worth redeeming. I think also his emotional responses, particularly to the visions of the Ghost of Christmas Past, really kind of, they show potential, that he's able to be moved by watching his childhood self, that he's able to feel pity for himself as a boy, shows us that he has this extraordinary potential to be redeemed.
Is there another one on the right here?
Wait, is that... In terms of when you're talking about what was happening at the time, and you talked about how the lower class and the middle class and the aristocracy, they all read the story, were there any parts of society or people who were critical of what the story was?
There were certainly people who didn't like A Christmas Carol, but on the whole, people were really quite dazzled by it. So Dickens's great rival, Thackeray, she just waxed lyrical. He loved it and was kind of, simultaneously deeply envious and filled with admiration for the work. I think because of its Christmas message, it was difficult for contemporaries to really find fault with a carol. And so although there certainly were critics, there's nothing with the amazing force of some of the critiques of his later works. I can think of Henry James slamming Our Mutual Friend because he was so disappointed with it. And I think for the most part there was just a really strong response to it and a real kind of public affection. So much so that A Christmas Carol becomes what the critic Paul Davis calls a culture text. And what he means by that is that it's been kind of assimilated into mainstream culture. So you can kind of say Scrooge's name to people who might never have read a word of Dickens, but they'll still identify with it, they'll still understand.
Isn't that sort of interesting though? And that was what I was sort of trying to ask you before in some ways too, about the difference between Karl Marx's and Lenin's response. And have there been further critiques? Because in some ways, I'm going about this in like 8 different directions now, but it will come together, I assure you. It is a conservative text in that, unlike a work like Hard Times, which is critical of the structure of oppression that's present within the text and all the industrialisation, Dickens is saying in A Christmas Carol that it's only really an individual person's job and not a structural issue, and if we just transform ourselves and go through this redemptive process, then somehow the world will be better, rather than attacking what's creating those structures, which he does in his later works. Have there been critiques like that since?
Certainly. And I think, one of the things to register is that Dickens is still very young when he is the author of A Christmas Carol. And this is a Christmas story, so it can't be a kind of sweeping revolutionary text. Dickens absolutely believes in the power of individual agency, but individual agency, of course, only works if everybody comes to work together. And that's why later he gets very depressed at the lack of social reform. In the 20th century, there have definitely been critiques of A Christmas Carol that kind of get impatient with its sentiment and its tweeness, and see it very much as a conservative text. One of my favourite critiques of the novella is from G.K. Chesterton, who refuses to believe in Scrooge's redemption, and he says this is not a softening of the heart, this is a softening of the head. A number of critics just think that it's kind of ludicrous that this will transform Scrooge in some way. So yes, it is a conservative text in that respect, but I don't think anything radical at Christmas time would have generated the level of interest and the level of sales that Dickens was looking for.
Other questions out there? Up the back.
Hey, would you say that it was a fear or regret that made Scrooge change?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's regret, but certainly there is something utterly terrifying about those final passages with the ghost of Christmas yet to come that definitely inspire fear. And it's clear that before that point, Dickens is on his road. He's on the road to transformation. We've seen him weep. We've seen him express regret for the conditions in which the Cratchit family lives. But there's definitely an element of fear there as well. So I think it's a combination of the two. And I think, to go back to Ruby's previous question, the other thing that Dickens wants to do is to plant a seed of fear within the reader, to make the reader understand that not all poverty is as picturesque, as sentimentalised as that of the Cratchits, that poverty can be really brutal and it can be potentially destructive. So he wants the reader to be fearful, but he doesn't want the reader to be too fearful, because otherwise he'll kind of lose them and alienate them.
Anyone else out there? Feel free to put your hand up. There's one up the front here. Ooh, our mic person is running. Quick.
Probably not worth the run.
Give us your questions.
just about, there's a passage where I think there's a real shift in tone, and I don't really understand it, about the altar, and, you know, death is sort of broken. I wondered if you could just comment upon that passage, and if you think it fits in smoothly, or do you find it strange too?
Can you tell me a bit more about the passage you're referring to?
Can you say a bit better than me?
I can't remember where it's from, but it's the one where he talks about death, and that from death that something else will grow. Can you remember the words, Kate?
No, but it's sort of this. I can't remember the words. I can't quote them. But it's a passage where, you know, he's seen his body being ravaged. Have I got anyone who knows it?
Here that knows the passage?
Oh yeah,
we've got a very. That's great.
It's got strike in it. And sow the world with life immortal. That passage, the whole kind of thing.
And this is when Scrooge is looking at his own body, is that right?
Yeah. Well, no, it's earlier.
I'm trying to place the passage.
It's almost as if people have acts of individual goodness,
yes,
that in a sense death then will create no fear, because those acts of individual goodness will live in an immortal way after the person has died. And therefore death in a sense is powerless in many ways, and that from those deaths of good people, their good deeds will live on and create the foundations of a good, equitable, more equitable and stable society.
Do you remember the passage?
Yes, I do, yeah. Yes, it does, absolutely. And I think that, you know, Dickens is trying to make sense of death, and he's trying to think about how the good life can lead to a good death. That, you know, for Scrooge as an evil character, death is obviously something to be feared because he's going to be punished as Jacob Marley was. But through something like Tiny Tim's death, we see something quite different. And there's that marvellous scene where Bob Cratchit is talking about the parting of the Cratchit family, and that first parting with Tiny Tim, when Tiny Tim has died. And he sort of says that we will all be better for having known Tiny Tim, and that we will never squabble for having known him. He will keep us together. So his good life and his good death kind of serve to make the Cratchit family's lives better, even though he's no longer with them. Whereas Scrooge, up until the point he's being haunted, has not led a good life, and there's nothing remotely positive about his death. His death is just isolated and lonely, and you know what the two characters. There are those two wonderful characters who are trying not to celebrate Scrooge's death because they're on the brink of financial collapse, and Scrooge's death relieves them, and they're guilty because they're delighted because he's died, and they're trying to soften their response to it, but they just can't. And it shows us the kind of reverse of Tiny Tim's life, that this is a bad life, and his death is just spreading joy when, you know, your death should be mourned, and your life should be celebrated. And so I think Dickens is presenting us with a very clear contrast there, and suggesting that, you know, as we sow in the world, so shall we reap.
On many levels, it's such a great text for us to be studying too, because I think unlike so many other texts that are contemporary, and this isn't actually a criticism of contemporary novels at all, just a comment, it actually does grapple with that idea of what it means to lead a good life, and maybe that's why it is, or it has been at least, such an enduring text as well. I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking Dr. Grace Moore.
Thank you very much.